Hi, this is Zac Woller Voice Ninja speaking. And since you enjoyed the first 3 parts of the Pagemaster book that I was reading to you, we've now come to the final part. So here's what we know about the story so far. After Richard lost his way into a library and met 2 unusual books, adventure and fantasy, he made a promise to check them out after he conquered his fears. After visiting the horror section, he met a strange, horrible book named Horror. And Richard also made a promise to check him out. After surviving many of the dangers, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Frankenstein monster, they then ventured into the adventure section, where they took on some of the most ruthless pirates like Long John Silver and the whale Moby Dick. But now, they have reached a happy ending for this book. The fantasy section! Can Richard make his way to the exit sign? Will he be able to check all 3 of the books? The finale to part 4 of the Pagemaster starts now. Using Fantasy's blinking wand as a guide, Adventure bushwhacked a path through a dense tropical jungle that led away from the beach. They were passing through some kind of corridor, but no one knew where it led. Fantasy studied her flickering wand. "Are you sure that yardstick is yours is working?" Adventure asked impatiently. "Well, why don't we just test it and find out?" Fantasy flicked the wand at Adventure. When the smoke had cleared, Adventure was floating in the air, dressed in fairy clothes, tutu, ballet slippers, wings, and lipstick. He looked at himself. "You've gone overboard this time, sister!" Adventure snarled. Fantasy studied the results of her magic. "You certainly are one ugly fairy," she said. Adventure shredded the costume with a sword, mumbling threats and other unmentionable things under his breath. As they moved farther into the jungle, the colours began to change. Many new and more brilliant hues fanned out before them. The spectacle filled Richard with awe. He was eager to see more. He pushed through a flower-lined thicket into a magical meadow. Fairy dust shimmered everywhere. Groves of trees hung heavy with fat, juicy buds. As Richard walked past, the ripe buds unfolded, offering not flowers, but books. "Wow! Look at this place!" Richard was mesmerized. Tiny Thumbelina flew over their heads on the back of a bird. She passed a castle tower where a handsome prince was climbing up the golden braid of a true love's hair. A majestic horse and carriage sped past. In a puff of light, the carriage magically turned into a pumpkin and the horses into mice. The cheery little mice bounced around Adventure's feet, offering squeaks of friendship. "Arr!" Adventure grumbled with disgust. "Happy land!" The mice scampered toward Horror, who accepted them enthusiastically. He fell back onto a soft bed of giggling flowers, ready to burst with joy. "I could be Miss Shelf here for a long time," he said. Soon, whole clusters of shimmering fairies arrived. They danced through the air around Richard and the books. "Hello, my little dearies," Fantasy greeted her twittering little friends. An especially delicate fairy flew down and landed on Richard's open hand. He gazed happily into its warm glow. In a playful gesture, the fairy snatched Richard's glasses. Richard laughed and gave chase. "Hey, my glasses!" Adventure drew his sword. "I knew it! They're all little thieves!" A cluster of fairies descended over Adventure and made off with his sword. "Hey! Now they've got me sword!" "Oh, they're just being playful," Fantasy defended her friend. "Playful? I'll show 'em playful when I get hold of the little..." Adventure clopped off after the fairies, yelling, "Come back here with me sword!" The fairy with Richard's glasses flew up to the top of the rocky hill. Richard, laughing at the joke, chased up the hill after her. The fairies with Adventure's sword enter the mysterious cave at the base of the hill. Adventure, fantasy, and horror all looked into the cave. wondering what they would find there. Adventure even lifted his eye patch, hoping he might spot his sword. Inside the cave, a strong wind whipped ribbons of red smoke around rows of sharply pointed stalactites and stalagmites.
It looks scary in there,
Horror stammered. Well, what are you waiting for? An invitation? Is Adventure scared to go in? Fantasy gave the old seaman a mocking glance. She was sure that he was stalling. Are you kidding, sister? I live for moments like this. Adventure reached for his sword, then remembered that it wasn't there. He felt naked without it. Clearing his throat, he led the way into the mysterious cabin with Fantasy and Horror following timidly behind him. Back on the rocky mound above the cave, Richard had gotten his glasses back from the mischievous fairy. When he put them back on, he noticed an amazing mountain in the distance. It seemed to be made entirely of books. A radiant light crowned its peak. Jeez! There it is! He exclaimed. Shimmering high above the mountain top was the exit sign. Cautiously, Adventure moved deeper into the hot, sticky cave. He found his sword there, lying on a stone. He grasped it firmly and held it up with obvious satisfaction. Hey, it's good to have you back, matey. He slashed it through the air, whacking off one of the stalactites, which dropped down and stuck into the soft cave floor. Suddenly, the whole ground began to tremble and shake violently. Meanwhile, up above, the rocks under Richard started to pitch and roll. His worst fear had come to haunt him. Earthquake! He shouted. He stumbled over to a broken ivory-coloured tree trunk and held on for dear life. In front of him, two huge round rocks rolled upward, revealing a pair of red, hot eyes. Suddenly, Richard realized that he was not standing on top of a rocky hill at all. He was right on the nose of a terrible dragon. And his friends were not in a rocky cave. They were inside the dragon's mouth. The huge stalagmites and stalactites were really the dragon's teeth. Adventure rushed at full speed toward the opening. A fireball shot out over his head just as he jumped out, with Fantasy and Horror right behind him. As the dragon reared its ugly head, it shook centuries of rocks and earth off its gigantic frame, and its roar echoed across the land. Birds took flight, and so did the wild animals. Richard's companions had awakened the sleeping dragon, and now somebody had to pay. Not to worry, I can handle this. Fantasy blew warm breath onto a blinking wand. Don't fail me now, she said. She flicked the wand in the direction of the dragon. A few sparks ignited at the tip, and the wand went limp as a wet noodle. Fantasy shook her head. Last time I buy a rechargeable wand. All this time, the dragon was torching everything around it. Its huge leathery wings pumped vigorously, fanning the flames. The once beautiful meadow was now turning into a blazing inferno. All at once, the dragon jerked its head back, throwing Richard high into the sky. He let out a blood-curdling scream. Ah! Fantasy turned to Horror. Quick! Open me up! Find page 1001! Horror licked his thumb and began slowly flipping through the pages. Page 1, page 2, page 3. Faster! Fantasy screamed. Horror flipped through the pages at blinding speed. 999, 1001. Arabian Nights? That's it! Fantasy ripped out the page, snapping it out like a wet towel, and turned it into a flying carpet. Save the boy! She commanded the carpet. It took off instantly, dipping and swerving around the dragon, and just in time it found its way under Richard, who was about to hit the ground. Richard rode off on top of it. The dragon shot out a fireball at the carpet, which maneuvered like a jet fighter plane. Dodging the flames, Richard screamed as the carpet headed straight for a tree. But at last, the last second it swerved, the cut back, dipped down, and skidded to a stop next to the books. Richard pointed up to the top of the mountain. The exit's up there, he said. Quick! jump on the carpet! The books jumped on. But just as they were about to take off, the dragon's tail slammed down onto the carpet's edge, pinning it to the ground. The jolt caused Fantasy's wand to pop on. This time, the light was strong and steady. "Well, it's about time," she said. She flipped the wand toward the dragon. An electrified charge shot out of the tip of her wand and blasted the beast. The angry dragon stopped in its tracks. A perplexed look crossed its face. Its eyes spun around like bingo balls. Then, in a fantastic explosion of smoke and sparks, it shrank into a harmless toad. "Wow! How'd you do that?" Richard was amazed. Fantasy proudly twirled the wand in her hand. "Magic. Women." Adventure grumbled under his breath. "Everything's magic to them." The dragon toad began to croak. Its eyes bulged out and its tail expanded by at least 3 feet. "Did I mention how fast a spell wears off on a dragon this size?" Fantasy said. The toad croaked again and grew 20 more feet. It blasted a spear of fire at the carpet, which shot off into the sky. Richard and the books clutched the carpet tightly as they streaked up into the clouds. It glided smoothly over the clouds, and although Richard was usually terrified of heights, the ride excited him. He almost didn't want it to end. Suddenly, the carpet veered and swooped down lower, taking them over magical cloud worlds filled with giants, genies, and castles. Then the carpet began to glide upward again toward the top of the mountain. "We're gonna make it!" Richard cheered. "We're gonna make it!" Horror repeated, but he was so excited that he accidentally knocked Fantasy's wand out of her hand. It tumbled over the edge of the carpet. "Oops! I wish that hadn't happened." Fantasy leaned over to see where the wand would land. It fell right into the mouth of the dragon, which was flying directly up toward them. Flapping its enormous wings, it shot out a fireball. The fireball exploded before it reached them, but the impact was strong enough to knock the carpet out of control. "What do we do now?" Adventure asked Fantasy. Fantasy lowered her head between her knees. "Assume crash positions, everyone!" With a tremendous bump, the carpet crashed smack into the side of the mountain. Richard landed on his back on a ledge formed by books. He was looking straight up at the exit sign. It seemed almost close enough to touch. Scrambling to his feet, he shouted, "Come on, guys!" The books, however, were tangled up in a heap below. "Get off me!" Adventure struggled to get up from under horror. Fantasy fluttered up out of the pile, yanking on her bloomers. While their pages were rustling, a dark shadow passed over. The 3 books looked up into the sky. The dragon was about to land on them! They scrambled into a narrow crevice on the side of the book mountain. The dragon landed on the ledge, trapping them inside. Meanwhile, Richard was scrambling up the mountainside. In his excitement at reaching the exit, he hadn't even looked back. He thought the books were right behind him. "We're almost there!" he shouted. With a final burst of energy, he climbed up the last few yards and stepped triumphantly onto the mountaintop. He could see the exit sign hovering over an ancient dome-shaped observatory. He breathed a well-deserved sigh of relief. "We did it, guys! We did it!" Then Richard turned round and discovered he was all alone. Looking down the side of the mountain, he spied the dragon peering into the crevice. Inside the crevice, the books were nervously looking out at the dragon, who reared back and shot a blast of flame at them. They flattened themselves against the wall so that the fire shot past. "A man can only take so much!" Adventure drew his sword. "This dragon is soon gonna be history!" He started toward the opening. "Be careful!" Fantasy said. In a grand gesture, Adventure grabbed Fantasy and gave her one big, juicy kiss. Mwah! Her eyes opened wide in surprise. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" She gave Adventure a shove, and he tumbled out of the crevice. From up above, Richard saw Adventure land on a ledge. "Adventure! I'm up here!" he shouted. Adventure looked up and saw Richard calling to him from the top of the mountain. "Go on, lad! Save yourself!" Adventure shouted. Just then, the dragon blasted another spear of fire in the old seaman's direction. Adventure stumbled back into the crevice, smouldering. His bandana was burned, and the hairs of his big moustache were sizzling. Horror blew out the flames. Now Richard was caught in a real dilemma. He had made it all the way to the exit sign, and he was almost free. The old Richard would have gotten out of there while he still had the chance. No question about it. But what about his new friends? Could he just abandon them? Weren't these books important enough for him to risk his 10-year-old neck trying to save them? "Help, master!" Richard heard Horror's distant wail coming up from below. "Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" Richard closed his eyes and made the toughest decision he had ever had to make. "Hang on, guys!" he shouted, racing down the side of the mountain. He stopped just long enough to borrow a sword, shield, and helmet from a night skeleton that lay alongside the path. Lifting the sword into the air, he yelled, "I'm coming!" Richard bounded down the mountain until he and the dragon stood face to face. Though terrified, the boy held his ground, slashing away with his sword. The dragon shot another spear of fire out of its mouth. It exploded against Richard's shield. The books peeked out from the crevice. "That's it, boy! Go for the gizzard!" Adventure shouted, slashing his sword toward the air. "Watch out for his tail!" Fantasy was nervously twisting Adventure's bandana. "Bind him! Bind him!" Horror jumped up and down. Richard aimed his sword toward the dragon's one soft spot, under the lower part of its neck, but before he could strike, the dragon whipped its tail around and snared the boy. The sword and shield fell to the ground, and the powerful tail lifted him up into the air. "Put me down, you ugly..." But before Richard could finish his sentence, the dragon, in one large gulp, swallowed him whole. Adventure, Fantasy, and Horror stared at each other in disbelief. "What a sad, sad ending," Fantasy whispered.
Master wasn't afraid of nothing.
Horror cried. "Aye, a braver lad never sailed the 7 seas," Adventure agreed. Sadly, Horror turned to grasp Adventure, but stopped. Adventure hesitated, then reached for the hunchback. Fantasy joined the huddle. Richard had tumbled down through the long throat tunnel into the pillowy bottom of the stomach. He quickly discovered that the inside of the dragon's stomach was a pulsating slime pit. The cavity was littered with bones, piles of books, trees, and anything else a dragon might eat. Loud grumbling noises were followed by small random eruptions of fire. There, Richard found Fantasy's wand. He tried to make it work, but it refused to respond. "This is not good at all," he thought. Up above, a pinpoint of light filtered down through the dragon's throat. Richard realized that up there was his only possible means of escape. He climbed up on top of a stack of books and reached up as high as he could. But the books slipped and toppled, sending him back to the bottom of the dragon's stomach. Frustrated, Richard began to kick at the books. Then he remembered something the Pagemaster had said. "When in doubt, look to the books!" Richard opened an old copy of Alice in Wonderland. Like a jack-in-the-box, the crazy Queen of Hearts' head popped out, hysterically ranting, "Off with his head! Off with his head!" Richard slammed the book shut, and the Queen was gone. Then he got another idea. He began searching frantically through the piles of books, rejecting one after another. Suddenly, he found what he was looking for. Jack and the Beanstalk. Opening the book, he placed it on the bottom of the dragon's stomach. At first, nothing. Then the book began to shake and rumble. Richard stepped back in anticipation. A thick beanstalk started to shoot up out of the pages. The stalk grew faster and faster, coiling up through the dragon's throat. Richard leapt onto the stalk and shot up with it. I hate heights! The dragon's eyes opened wide. His head jerked back and his mouth flipped open. Suddenly, out shot the giant beanstalk. Adventure, fantasy, and horror watched in amazement. They were even more surprised when Richard came riding up out of the dragon's mouth. Come on! Richard yelled. Jump on! He gathered the books in his arms, and up they all went. They jumped off at the top of the mountain. Horror hugged Richard's legs. Master, you saved us! That you did, matey. You did good, honey, said Fantasy. When she saw that he was carrying her wand in his pocket, she kissed him on the cheek. Mwah! My hero, she gushed. Richard looked up. Just ahead of them, hovering over the observatory, he saw the glowing green exit sign. The tall oak doors pushed open, and Richard and the books entered a circular room. Their faces were illuminated by a bright funnel of light rising up out of a gigantic crystal dome. Something shifted in the shadows. Who's there? Richard strained for a better look. Slowly, a figure stepped out into the light. My Pagemaster! Adventure removed his bandana and bowed respectfully. Horror threw himself onto the floor. Fantasy courtesied. Hey, how did you get here? Richard was not too pleased to see the Pagemaster again. Now, we're in the presence of the Pagemaster. Fantasy laid a hand on Richard's shoulder, trying to silence him. I know who he is! He's the guy who put me through all this torture! Just look at me! Richard said, calling attention to his dirty and tattered clothing. Do you have any idea what I've been through? Tell me. The Pagemaster seemed interested. Richard collected his thoughts. Well, I was nearly torn apart by a mad doctor. I was made a slave by a bunch of mangy pirates. And believe it or not, I was even eaten by a fire-breathing dragon. Not to mention being tossed, squashed, and scared practically to death. Yet you stand before me. The Pagemaster's steady gaze gradually overcame Richard's stubborn resistance. Well, yeah. Horror knelt at the Pagemaster's feet, begging mercy for his disrespectful friend. He don't mean nothing by it, my Pagemaster. He don't mean it. Nonsense. The boy is right. I purposely sent him through the fiction section. So you admit it? Richard felt vindicated. Of course. Think, boy. What kind of an adventure would you have if I'd brought you here with a turn of the page? He waved his staff over the crystal dome. The light in it began to waver. A ghostly image of Mr. Hyde appeared inside the funnel, then quickly changed into the gentle Dr. Jekyll, who tipped his hat to Richard. You prevailed over evil. Other images appeared inside the funnel. Captain Ahab and Long John Silver. Ahab pointed his finger at Richard. You look me in the eye, boy! Long John Silver looked at Richard and gave him a wink. You had true pirate stuff, lad. He placed his big hand over his cutlass. And don't you let no one speak different. Now the Pagemaster pointed his staff at Richard. If I had brought you here from the start, you never would have found the courage to face your own fears. Richard gasped as the dragon materialized inside the funnel. It blasted a spear of fire mist and faded away with the other images. And in doing so, you triumphed and will always triumph. Richard felt good, proud, almost invincible. Fantasy cast a halo of fairy dust over his head. With the wave of the Pagemaster's staff, the crystal dome glowed brightly. Richard gazed into the glass. He was looking down into the library rotunda, where his body lay motionless on the floor. Hey! That's me! That was you, said the Pagemaster. I'm ready to go back now. I mean, we're ready. Richard gathered adventure, fantasy, and horror around him. Your world awaits. The pagemaster waved his staff. A whirlwind suddenly whipped up above the dome, sweeping Richard and the books into its vortex of swirling light. The sound was deafening, a cacophonous mix of wind, fluttering pages, and murmuring voices. The voices were whispering phrases that now had meaning for Richard. Fiction from A to Z, where all is possible. It's the devil of the deep, the white whale. All human beings are possessed of both good and evil. He's the meanest and most black-hearted pirate ever sailed the seven seas.
Sanctuary! Sanctuary!
And they all lived happily ever after. The mural at the top of the rotunda became a swirling blur. A column of bright colours dipped down from the centre, taking Richard and the books with it. Richard fell straight down into his prostrate body. Next to him, adventure, fantasy, and horror all hit the hard marble floor and turned into ordinary books. Richard's eyes opened wide. He was staring up at the mural. His gaze was fixed on the painted image of the pagemaster. Then, out of nowhere, the librarian Mr. Dewey was leaning over Richard, blocking the pagemaster's image. You took quite a spell, young man. Huh? Richard shook his head, trying to think more clearly. He looked around. Above the stacks, he saw the exit sign, looking as if it had always been there. Without thinking, without any hesitation, he scrambled to his feet and ran toward it. Careful, or you'll slip again, Mr. Dewey warned him. He began collecting the 3 old dusty books off the floor. Down the aisle, Richard skidded to a stop. He looked back and saw Mr. Dewey gathering the books. Wait! He called. Richard ran back into the rotunda. I forgot something. He took the books out of Mr. Dewey's arms and presented his library card. Mr. Dewey examined the torn and dirty card with interest. I'm afraid you could only check out 2 today, he said, removing horror from the top of the stack. But I promised I'd check him out! You promised whom? Richard pointed to horror. Him. Do you think just this once I could? Please, Mr. Dewey? I really need... Mr. Dewey raised a silencing hand. Shh. I have a talent for guessing what people need. He glanced around to make sure that no one else was watching, then placed horror back in Richard's arms. Just this once. Richard thanked Mr. Dewey and hurried down the aisle toward the exit. Godspeed to you, boy! The rain-washed streets glimmered with the orange light of the setting sun. The storm had passed. Richard rode his bike with confidence down the tree-lined street. The 3 books were nestled comfortably in the bicycle basket. Richard turned a corner. Dead ahead, the bike-riding kids were still gathered round the ramp. Richard stopped. Look who came back! One of the kids called. Hey, Tyler, you gonna chicken out again? Richard's heart pumped fast but sure as he steered his bike toward the ramp. The bike picked up speed. Faster and faster it went. Faster than it had ever gone before. The other kids scrambled to get out of his way. Richard hit the ramp at full speed. The bike lifted into the air, higher than any kid had ever gone. The other kids watched in awe as it landed solidly on the wet asphalt. Richard pedaled on, never looking back. Stars filled the sky over the Tyler house. Richard's bike lay on its side on the front lawn as the family minivan pulled up into the driveway. Claire! Look! That's Richard's bike! Thank God he's safe. I was beginning to think that we would never find him. Richard's mother breathed a deep sigh of relief. Suddenly, the treehouse caught their attention at the same time. A warm yellow light glowed from within its walls. You think it's Richard up there? Mr. Tyler asked. He climbed up the ladder to see. Taking one look, he motioned for his wife to come up too. Inside the treehouse, an old lantern cast a yellow light over a sleeping Richard and the 3 books nestled in his arms. "Poor baby," Richard's mum said proudly. "He looks exhausted. Shouldn't we carry him to his bed? Let's let him sleep up here tonight." Richard's dad then covered his son with his jacket and turned off the lantern. Before climbing down, he kissed Richard on the cheek and whispered, "You must have had quite a trip, son. I'm very proud of you, Richard." In the darkness of the treehouse, something stirred. The sound of pages rustling.
It's dark out here.
Horror whispered to Fantasy.
I wish there was a night light.
"Honey, why didn't you say so?" With a blink of her wand, she made the lantern flare up again, illuminating the books who were back to their old selves. And then she looked around and took a deep breath. "Just smell it! Breathe it in, mate!" He thrust his sword into the air. "Now this be the land of adventure!" That was the end of The Pagemaster by David Kirshner and Ernie Contreras. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I did reading it to you. Stay tuned for more audiobook recordings that I have coming up in the future, and don't forget to subscribe, like and share, and ring the bell to get notified about my latest videos. From all of us here, this is Zac Woller Voice Ninja signing off, and remember, if you ever go to a library, remember what the Pagemaster said: when in doubt, look to the books inside your heart. Until we meet again, farewell.